Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're just carrying on with this series of fables and folk tales. Almost said it the wrong way. And we're just, the parables of Jesus. And we're just going to jump right in. We're going to actually talk about two parables today. There's going to reason for that, but we'll get into that in the midst of the conversation.
Yep.
But we're going to start. I'm going to read one parable, the parable of the friend at midnight.
Yep.
And then Ron will read the other parable, and then we'll kind of just talk about it, and we'll say why we're actually
looking at
doing two parables today. All right, here we go. Luke 11, verse 5. Then teaching them more about prayer, he used this story. I should read this right. Suppose you went to a friend's house at midnight, wanting to borrow 3 loaves of bread, and you say to him, "A friend of mine has arrived for a visit, and I have nothing for him to eat." And suppose he calls out from his bedroom, "Don't bother me. The door is locked for the night, and my family and I are all in bed. I can't help you." But I tell you this, though he won't do it for friendship's sake, if you keep knocking long enough, he will get up and give you whatever you need because of your shameless persistence. And so I tell you, keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and everyone who knocks, the door will be open.
All right, the second parable we're looking at today is from Luke chapter 18. It's called the parable of the persistent widow. One day Jesus told his disciples a story to show that they should always pray and never give up. There was a judge in a certain city, he said, who neither feared God nor cared about people. A widow of that city came to him repeatedly, saying, "Give me justice in this dispute with my enemy." The judge ignored her for a while, but finally he said to himself, "I don't fear God and I don't care about people, but this woman is driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice because she is wearing me out with her constant requests." Then the Lord said, "Learn a lesson from this unjust judge. Even he rendered a just decision in the end. So don't you think that God will surely give justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will grant justice to them quickly. But when the Son of Man returns, how many will he find on earth who have faith?" So in this first parable about the friend at midnight, this comes just after Jesus has been with his disciples and he's gone away to pray and he's come back, and the disciples are asking Jesus to teach them how to pray. And he demonstrates for them by teaching them what we call the Lord's Prayer. And so that's pretty straightforward. And except when you think about it, it's interesting that Jesus' disciples asked him how to pray. If you know anything about Jewish cultures, it's permeated with prayer.
Yeah, it really is.
They pray when you wake up. They have a prayer when you go out the door, a prayer when you come in. You see that thing where they touch the little thing on the door, and they say a little prayer every time they eat or drink something, and every time they lie down. And many other times during the day, they have kind of these
There are certain times
prayers.
you stopped and you prayed.
So I guess the question for me is, why did they ask Jesus to teach them how to pray? And to answer my own question, it actually came about in a devotional my wife and I are doing together. And it's by Tyler Staton, I think his name is, and it's based on his book, An Invitation to Wonder and Mystery of Prayer. He says that they asked Jesus because Jesus prayed differently to what they were used to, in addition to what they were used to. So Jesus prayed, he was Jewish, so he prayed all the same prayers, but in addition to that, he did something different. So he seemed to have some connection to God that was different because of the way he prayed. So I think that's an interesting perspective on the question, teach us to pray.
Yeah.
So immediately after that, Jesus tells them this parable about sort of the effectiveness of prayer, I guess. And I guess as we kind of break down the parables, we'll do both of them together at the same time.
Sounds good.
Just because, and the reason we're doing two together is they kind of make the same point.
That's right.
And so let's talk about that then. So who represents the person who is asking for bread in the first parable and the widow in the second parable?
Basically, this should be the person who's praying.
Yeah.
So this is where we hopefully see ourselves.
Yeah.
Like we are praying to God. So, yeah, the person asking for bread, the widow, it's us, the person.
Yeah, asking for justice. Okay, so this is interesting. In the NIV application commentary by Daryl Bach on Luke, he reminds us in the case of the friend at midnight that bread was just not readily available to buy.
Yeah, there's no supermarkets.
There's no supermarkets and there's no 24-hour Walmarts. Everybody made their bread daily. So, and most of the time you would have a loaf or two around, kind of for breakfast kind of thing, because it takes time to bake bread and so on. But the assumption here is that this is as a small town, and the culture in this small town has one of hospitality. Yeah. So a person could show up late in the evening and expect that they would be welcomed. Yeah. So in the other parable, the widow, and a widow in that culture was someone who was in a very vulnerable situation.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, they weren't. Yeah, they didn't have necessarily a lot of status.
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily. They could quite often be poor.
Yeah, it was a very patriarchal culture, and that's why I think the Torah or the law made specific allowances for widows to be protected.
That's right.
Okay, let's go on and talk about the friend or the judge. Who do they represent?
Well, they're kind of, in a sense, representing God, in a way, because they're definitely don't get too. You shouldn't get too like on that. We were like, what's the unjust judge?
Yeah,
it's more the idea of they are the person hearing the request.
Yeah, and I think Jesus uses hyperbole here on purpose to make a point. But yeah, I think that in a way that does kind of fit with what we're trying to say. So, and it's interesting here. How does the friend or the judge initially respond?
Well, they both kind of like, leave me alone.
Yeah. Now, it kind of makes sense in the first case. We have the friend at midnight and the small towns. These kind of rural towns were usually 1 or 2 room houses.
That's right.
So you kind of had the stable or the barn on the lower floor, and then you lived on the upper floor. Or sometimes they lived on the bottom floor with the animals, and the upper floor was like a room that they used for guests. If it was nighttime and everybody's in bed, everybody's sleeping in the same room.
Yeah, everyone's together. It's not like what we're used to. It's just like the kids are over there, and we can kind of isolate things a little bit. It's if anything's gonna happen, everyone's gonna be aware.
And that's the kind of point the guy makes in the parable, is that I can't give you anything. I'm gonna wake everybody up. Go away. You're bothering me. Yeah. So what about in the second case? Why does the judge put off the widow?
Well, just that's more pointing to the judge himself, just being a jerk.
Yeah. Jesus even says he's unjust. Yeah. He's not doing his job according to the law. That always kind of cracks me up. So we don't want to read too much into that as being God, but again, I think Jesus is using hyperbole here. So, but eventually, in both cases, they gave in due to the persistence of the asker.
Yes.
So in verse 8 of Luke 11, the story about the friend, it's interesting that it says that he gave in, but not for friendship's sake. Now, if you look in the footnotes on Bible Gateway, it says that it was in order to avoid shame, or so his reputation won't be damaged. And I'm thinking, why would the reputation of the friend be damaged if he doesn't give bread to his friend who's asking? And again, this is this small town thing again, where the context here is that the town shares the responsibility for hospitality among neighbors. And being a small town, if you refuse to help somebody, it could look bad on you.
Yeah, and it is, I think, a bit of a stretch for our immediate understanding, because our thought would go to, well, the guy didn't have bread.
Yeah.
And so, again, going back to what we just mentioned before, like he doesn't necessarily would have bread because they make kind of enough for the day and maybe a bit, and then not expecting a traveler. Then a traveler comes, going to a neighbor for help, and it's that person then who would be heard like, hey, your friend came to you, and you didn't
help them.
You didn't help them. That looks bad on all of us to do that. It's all about building the community. So it's a community-minded thing.
And we don't think like that at all today. If someone knocks on my door after midnight, I don't answer the door. If they persist, I call the police.
That's right.
Kind of thing, right? So I think it's kind of a little bit more difficult for us to relate to the specifics of that one. So, but yeah, it's in essence, his reputation could be affected negatively now.
It won't be the friend who came. It'll fall on.
Yeah.
It'll kind of be him that really is the one that is bringing
Whether he helped or not.
that, not working through the hospitality that makes the whole entire community look good.
And again, in the second case with the judge, he doesn't care about his reputation. He gives in purely for her persistence.
Probably he's not going to make enough money off her. Or something like that.
Or she wouldn't bribe him or something.
Yeah.
He obviously is unjust. But again, Jesus is using hyperbole here to exaggerate the willingness of the person responding. So it's not saying that God doesn't respond that way. He's saying that if your friend or your judge eventually gets around to helping you, even though they don't want to, imagine how much more willing God is to respond to our prayers.
Well, and I think that is the mistake we can make. That this, as much as yes, persistence is good. We persist in prayer. Mm-hmm. It is not about the idea of we're persisting in prayer simply because we know that God is the person who can do something about it. And will. As opposed to persisting in prayer because eventually he'll give in.
Yeah.
Like that is not the...
Yeah, we don't have to force God's hand.
That's right. That's not the point of the story. It's just like eventually God will do something because you're annoying him.
Yeah.
It's the idea of these people will do this. How much more a good God who cares about you will.
Exactly. So again, another little tidbit here that you might not always think of. Why do we have two parables with very different stories that kind of make the same point? What's up with Jesus here?
Well, I think this is where, and we talked about it a little bit on Sunday, is the fact that Jesus, he didn't necessarily, as he goes town to town, place to place, have I've got a new sermon every time I land. A new thing. He really is repeating himself. And it's quite often what we can see in these Gospels is sometimes we're seeing similar stories, but they didn't necessarily happen in the same place because he would tell or teach a similar thing.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes he would tailor, especially in parables, basically the idea of teaching that thing that in a sense that would make more sense in the context he's in.
Sure.
Much like he said with the person coming for the bread at night, this is a rural setting.
Yeah, people in a small town can relate to that.
Yeah, and it's very much so they probably wouldn't necessarily relate to the idea of a judge being there because they probably didn't necessarily mean there might not have been
a judge there. Yeah.
Whereas the other one is is happening in a big city, and where you might have a little bit more people like a widow. People who are a little down and out, they're going to be found anywhere, but you can find that because that's where they might be able to get things and help them in those moments. And that's where you're going to find more of a judge. And so that whole reality is just going to be a little bit more real in the urban setting, city, which is basically where this is happening.
Yeah, in a lot of small towns, you don't see, for example, the amount of homeless people because the community takes care of people.
Yeah.
And where in the big city you see it more because they're easier to fall through the cracks.
Well, that and I think there's more available for helps that just happen in a bigger city. That can be part of it too.
So Jesus is tailoring the same message to whoever his audience is.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's important to note is that this is a really important thing Jesus is trying to say, and yet he's telling it in a couple of different ways so people can relate to it.
Well, and also it makes us just be able to, I guess, understand even our Bibles a little bit more, especially the Gospels. When we do see the repeats, it's a good chance because this was a pretty common theme. Most of the places would have heard this.
Yeah.
And the reason it's in there is because, well, he would have said this many, many times.
Yeah.
And again, he didn't have necessarily a million sermons. He had about a dozen or so, and they were the important ones.
And I've even heard people say that, that Jesus tells they say it's a recording of the same story, by two different authors. They tell it different ways. And yet, when you think about it, it's probably the same story being told by Jesus in two different places, being written down and maybe changed a little bit.
Yeah, subtleties.
It's just the way you tell a story orally. You don't always tell it the same way twice, kind of thing.
Well, I can even think of times when I've done sermons, the same sermon, in different places, and mostly it's the same, but
It's not word for word.
It's not word for word.
Yeah,
There's some
exactly.
differences. There's even sometimes when, depending on time, you might think like, oh, I might emphasize this a little bit more because of such and such a reason.
Or after you've had a chance to think about it, you think of another example.
Well, exactly. And they even though it's basically the same thing, it has some variances.
Yeah. So it really is just Jesus making the same point. So again, as with all parables, what can we sort of learn? What do we take away from this that we can apply today?
Well, that God does hear us.
Yeah.
We can pray boldly without fear. He is going to respond. Again, but especially looking at the parable of the unjust judge, it's like he's going to if that unjust judge would eventually respond, how much more?
Exactly.
And that's really the point. It's like we can ask. He will. He wants to respond.
Yeah, and I've heard some people say that, that I've talked to, that they're intimidated by a God who's all powerful, and they're afraid to sort of just ask, why would God bother with me if he's so big and powerful and taking care of things? And then we see sort of the other side of that too, is that God is wanting to answer prayers, but we sometimes feel like he's too busy with more important things.
Right.
Somebody I know has cancer, and somebody I know has gone bankrupt, and I need a parking spot kind of thing. And we just don't think our thing is important enough to ask.
Yeah.
And I think what Jesus is saying here, it's important for us to ask.
Yeah.
And then we get down to the idea of, as you said before, sometimes it doesn't seem like he's answering our prayer, but he kind of intimates that we should keep asking. Yeah. And it's not like we can sort of pester him into answering. But why does he want us to continue to ask? I think you answered it before.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a part. Well, we've answered it before when we about a year ago when we were going through what if Jesus was serious about prayer, and a lot of that is because a lot of the asking is also in the midst of relationship.
Yeah.
And so he does not want us to sort of like just give up or to miss out on what he is answering this prayer. He may not answer it in then sometimes the way we expect.
Yeah.
I've definitely experienced that many, many times. And sometimes looking back, I'm like, oh, hey, yeah, that was the answer.
Yeah. Let's delve into that in more detail in a minute. But I think I really want to emphasize the point you just made, though, was that it's important to keep asking to stay in a relationship.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the answer has certain ramifications, which we'll talk about in a second. But in the meantime, Jesus still wants to let us know that he's still with us.
Well, and that our relationship with him is not purely interactional.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Transactional.
Transactional. Thank you. And he's wanting somewhat more, and it's out of a communion, a community, a relationship with him that we are asking, and not just sort of the list and
yes or no, check.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think the last thing that I sort of made a point of here, what we can take away is that God really does care about us and about justice, and he does definitely act accordingly. Now, as you mentioned in our previous series about prayer, in What If Jesus Was Serious About Prayer by Skye Jethani, we had talked about in a previous podcast that God does not always answer our prayers with a yes.
Yeah.
So that's just a fact. And some of the things we have to consider is, why would God answer no?
Yeah, because maybe it wouldn't be good for us.
Yeah.
It may negatively affect others. I think that's a big one too. Because we tend to
think about ourselves more.
And maybe this isn't always the best. Or maybe there's something better.
Yeah.
And there's something
that's
in
something
the
we rarely consider. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's really important to know, and I really, as in the last, I would say, several years, for me, this has become more real. We live in a culture of faster is better.
Yep.
And definitely that is not something necessarily God presents, at least not presented in the Bible. He moves a little slower.
Yep.
And there's a reason.
And sometimes we just have to wait.
And there's much growth that happens in the waiting. It's not always fun, but there's much growth.
Yeah, and we do need to learn to be patient.
Yeah,
so
it's a fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah, yes, it is.
And on that note,
yes, we're going to just end it there. That's kind of the notes we've got to put together and our thoughts on this parable. So again, we always love to hear what you think about or what your interpretation is. So if you would like to make a comment in the note section, and you can leave us a comment and tell us what maybe you were taught this parable means, or what, after reading it yourself, or it's maybe something we talked about kind of gave you some ideas or some thoughts. We'd love to hear about it. And again, in processing these parables and what Jesus said, it's always good to reread them for yourself, and then maybe talk about it with a friend. And if you're part of our church community, to share that with your missional community when you meet in homes, and talk about what the parables mean, and just get into the practice of doing what we just did, which is kind of break it down. Say, what does this person represent? What does that person represent? What's the point Jesus is trying to make? And then how do I kind of apply that to my own life? So it's always good to process those things and really kind of figure out how you're going to embrace that and apply it in your life. So again, thank you very, very much for kind of joining us on this journey. And we'd ask you to like and subscribe to our channel so that we can continue to do this. And hopefully we'll see you as we bring the next podcast in our series, Fables and Folktales.